thank you all for joining us. We are faculty members at George Mason University, where we are very interested in engaging with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And this session was organized around Sustainable Development Goal number 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions. And that particular goal works to promote peaceful and inclusive societies, access to justice, and strong, accountable institutions. And the following speakers, Karina Korostelina, Louise Shelley, Cher Chen, and Susan Allen will each be speaking about some of the projects and initiatives they're doing in order to create on the ground change in this area. So I'm going to hand it over to Karina, and I'll let each of you guys introduce yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, for organizing that. Let me first try to share the screen. So I'm a professor at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. It's a school which some people maybe know before as a SCAR, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And I will be speaking today about one project which we conduct in Ukraine. So very quick review of Ukrainian situation. In 2014, Russia took control over peninsula of Crimea and then occupied eastern part of Ukraine. Current situation in Ukraine is considered as a low intensity war. Russia still controls territory around election in eastern Ukraine, and the major problem is 1.7 million of internally displaced people. And this is represent for you map how these internally displaced people are located, with majority of them being in the east of Ukraine, right near the so-called line of contact. And Ukraine now is the 9th largest country with number of IDPs people. So this is a very big problem for Ukraine. And one of the approaches we decided to apply to address this issue is resilience approach. Resilience become a very important foundation for current development and peace work. And you can see resilience really prevalent in current documents of European Union, even in United States and across. What is important that resilience is a dynamic process. It's not end process, because it's help people to reclaim their communities from perpetrators of violence, reduce impact of chronic violence on these communities, and create space for well-being of all citizens. What is important to notice that resilience is not negative or positive. What is important that people can be resilient to violence, or some systems of violence can be resilient to change. So we really need to control, and we need to manage, and we need to create processes of resilience so they will be added to peace-building processes. What is important that actors self-organize. It's really about agency of people, production of knowledge, and also creation of institutions which support particular processes. And what is important for us that the more we create multiple responses, multiple approaches to resilience, the stronger will be the result. And in this particular project, we use the theory which I developed in my forthcoming book on resilience. It's a 4-loop model of resilience, which shows us that in the center of resilience are practices of resilience. It's what people actually do, what actions they create, produce, and maintain to create resilience. And what is important, that these practices of resilience depends on such factors like structure of conflict, dynamic of identity and power, community capacities, external resources. But the most important, they actually change them in the process of action, in the process of situation. So how these practices of resilience are designed not to only address major problems in society, but actually change it this is what is important, how this is theory which was applied in this particular project. So the project which we developed in Ukraine, in Eastern Ukraine, in collaboration with Kharkiv University, is to develop youth leadership in community enhancement through internship in local administrations. So what we're actually doing, we're not just working with university to create curricula or educate students or improve their education. We're actually working with universities to make them centers of community. The idea that we develop 3-week internship through which students go to administration, local NGOs, and establish connections with them and also educate them. So this is, I will speak about specifically about all 3 components quickly. First, establishment of internship program for students. What is important that this 3-week program is experiential learning course, which we educate students about, first of all, we educate faculty about resilience. Group of our faculties plan to go to Kharkiv, but we also conducted several seminars online to educate them about identity, resilience in these 3 participating universities, and provide knowledge for them how to actually create the idea of internship, how to engage with local NGOs and local administrations so students will be really active parts of change. It's how they can create these resilience practices in order to address problems of conflict. And so we developed this group of coordinators who develop in courses and started working with different organizations in their communities to place this internship. Second component is implementation. So workshop will be organized to teach students how to deal with issues, IDPs, integration, resilience, conflict resolution. And so what will be see how students will be engaged in the work of local administrations. They will not only participate in ongoing activities, but they also will help design and establish new programs. They will help evaluate, assess effectiveness activities and programs, and their major idea will be increase capacity of local administrations and NGOs, how to work with communities and how to concentrate on practices of resilience. And finally, we will have this assessment, which is very important part of the project, that students and coordinators will all come together in one place from multiple universities and multiple cities to discuss what worked, what did not work, what was the lessons learned, how we can make this process more effective. And we also will include to this conference invite representatives of local administrations and NGOs so they can give their own feedback. What actually worked for resilience building? What microdynamics of identity and power had to be included and what problems have to be addressed? What community capacities were built during these internships and what should be addressed more? And as the outcome of this project, we see that it's not only will help communities, as I stressed multiple times, but also improve career counseling for students. Now we expect that students who went through IP will be actually knowing what to expect for them in the future, and they will be placed. We expect that at least several regions will be hiring the students which work there, providing them particular jobs. And we expect that it's together with increasing capacity of university, we also expect that this particular project will result in wider role of universities as active agents of change in their communities. Hope I did my right time.
Thank you, Karina. We could do have a few minutes for questions if there's any questions from the participants. This is the first time I've been on this platform, so I'm not quite sure how you'll do that, but I can see that there's a chat box And if you're unable, you're also able to unmute yourself, please do that and ask. There's a few enough in this room that I think that we can make that work. I'll give people a second to figure out if they can do that. Otherwise, we'll move on to Louise. All right, I'm not seeing anything come through the chat. Nobody's speaking up, so I think we'll move straight on to Louise, and hopefully we can have a more robust discussion at the end. So, Louise.
Thank you. So I'm Louise Shelley, and I'm the first chair and a university professor in the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason. But more central to my existence is that I am the director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center. And when you hear those terms, you must say to yourself, what is this person doing in a panel on sustainability and ending conflict? I mean, this sounds like something where you're bringing in police and arms, or you're bringing in law enforcement, and that's quite the opposite from what we're all about. So why is what we're doing so central to ending conflict and promoting sustainability? How do conflicts sustain themselves? Conflicts need money. And often in a conflict situation, there is no legitimate money around. So we just heard from Karina about the problems in Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. And if you know the Crimea, which is this strip of land that goes into the Black Sea, you'll know that it is a highly criminalized region with large numbers of criminals that came from Russia, and they worked with some local criminals. And this criminal economy of this crucial space is absolutely central to undermining stability and ending the conflict in eastern Ukraine, because this illicit economy pays for arms, it pays for fighters, it pays for all kinds of things that prolong conflict. So if you want to think about how you build a resilient society, you need to think about illicit economies that are absolutely central to the perpetuation of conflict. And it depends what resources are available for you to trade in. For example, 90% of conflicts are very close to some of the world's greatest centers of biodiversity in the world. And so criminals, terrorists, guerrillas are very deeply involved in the illicit trade of timber, of charcoal, of minerals, of gold. And so one of the key things to understand is how you cut off these sources of supply that allow these conflicts to go on, so that the criminals become sidelined, corruption is not a way of life, and you begin to develop some signs of governance in a region in which mafia bosses become the rulers because there's no other form of governance. So sometimes you don't have natural resources. So what do you have? You have human beings. And then human beings can be trafficked for labor, for sex trafficking, or people are escaping areas of violent conflict, such as we're having in the United States and Central America, which have the highest rates of violence in the world, and they pay enormous amounts of money to smugglers to escape or to save their children who are now gathering on our border. And then if you don't have natural resources or people, then sometimes, as in the Middle East, you have antiquities that can be dug up and sold. So what is our research? What are we doing? Depending on the period that we're in, we're working on a variety of these different forms of illicit trade that are so pernicious to good governance, to establishing rule of law. A couple years ago, we did research on the illicit antiquities trade out of Iraq and Syria. But sometimes, because we're living in a global economy with global supply chains, dealing with this problem is not just at the source, but at the point of sales. And we're finding that increasing amounts of this trade is going online. And you have to get Western online businesses to get out of this trade to reduce the profits that keep those engaged in conflict out of business. So one of the things that we try and understand is where are the points of vulnerability? Who needs to be involved in stopping this illicit trade? And how do you then provide a space and an opportunity for this exploitation of natural resources, of people, or the destruction of cultural history, all of which are being used to fund conflict at the present time? Last week, we had a wonderful presentation for a project that we do with WWF, Traffic, and U4 on corruption and natural resource governance. And we had journalists who are at the front lines of doing investigations of environmental crime and corruption, many of them in conflict regions, explain to people who are in conservation and resource management how these problems are operating so that they can help address them in their communities. Because sometimes these criminals are coming and destroying indigenous communities, destroying the lands on which they're living. And these are absolutely key factors that destroy local traditions of governance, and the corruption that they gain from these sales destroys any possibility of rule of law. So that's where our focus is, on trying to understand what I would call the spoilers of creating rule of law, and how they are vulnerable and how they can be turned around, and how Western facilitators, who are often part of these supply chains, can be changed or forced to change to stop providing the money that is so essential for the perpetuation of conflict.
Thank you, Louise. That was great. Again, any questions for Louise? Feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself if you're able. All right. Seeing none come in, why don't we pass it over to Cher? And I have your slides, so give me a second and I'll get them up on the screen.
Well, it has been so fascinating to learn what Karina and Louis have done. My name is Xiaowei Chen. I'm an associate professor with School of Integrative Studies. This is an interdisciplinary school at George Mason University. So I'm so delighted to have this opportunity to have a conversation with my brilliant colleagues today on SDG 16. I'm a human rights scholar. So doing human rights research and work is my passion and mission. So Leah, do you mind go to the next? Yes. So as you can see, actually today, those noble ideas and values have guided the mission of George Mason, as well as Mason right now fully embrace SDG 16 to promote peace and justice. And so, I think this should be all men and women are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, of which when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity namely the enjoyment of life and liberty. And so as a human rights scholar, this is something I truly believe in. And my scholarship has been primarily about three sub-areas: women's rights, indigenous rights, and well-being of social justice and human rights activists. And I strongly believe in conducting interdisciplinary research and try to focus on the areas that have been overlooked but carry significant practical implications. The so-called translational research. In particular, Leah, do you mind go to the next slide? And I try to go beyond just being a scholar and disseminate research findings that address human rights and global justice challenges in both academic and practitioners conferences. So through my research, I try to work to build some long-term collaborative and partnership with local, national, and global social justice and human rights organizations. And I also try to work with my colleagues to promote events, teaching or training on human rights and global justice to students, practitioners, policymakers, and educators. And so I co-founded the undergraduate program in social justice and human rights here at Mason. I'm glad to report that it has witnessed an increasing enrollment. And also we founded a graduate program, MAIS, in social justice and human rights, as well as a kind of a more connecting research and practice, the human rights and global justice initiative. So the ultimate goal for me as a human rights scholar is always to help create a sustainable social change. So today I will focus on a special project I have been working on in the past several years: the well-being of social justice and human rights activists. Before I start, I'd like to share with you a little story. So several years ago, I went to a conference and sat right next to a human rights activist during a panel discussion, and her name is Addison. After the panel discussion, we started chatting, and she told me activism is lonely. So this just hit me like a bolt of lightning. From then on, my curiosity about this unique population never stops. So those activists, for me, they risk their life to help victims of genocide, human trafficking, sexual slavery, and so on. And they strive to combat discrimination, injustice, and dictatorship. So could we do something to help them? And that is when my former colleague, Dr. Paul Gorski, and I have come up with this research project on the well-being of social justice and human rights activists. We have since interviewed a significant number of those activists in US and around the world. Through the research, we found that social justice and human rights activists, even though they dedicate themselves to serving others, the larger community and the world, they themselves have been underserved. Internally, there's this prevailing culture of martyrdom that has prevented them from addressing their own health and well-being challenges. Even though many of them, they suffer from high rates of burnout and various mental and physical health issues. And these health challenges have adverse effects on social movement and the important work of social transformation. Externally, the outside communities, including academics, have paid scarce attention to the health and well-being of social justice and human rights workers. So I hope to continue this research, and someday we could have a robust data set that covers a range of countries. I also started to dream big, dreaming about creating a transnational activist community. And I'm now collaborating with faculty and student organizations, activist communities, local and national organizations. Hopefully, we could have a true transnational actives network, and this network could build links among activists in civil societies, states, and international organizations, and it could help multiply the opportunities for dialogue and communication and make resources available, particularly to people in domestic, political, and social struggles. And this network, I envision it will have a significant web presence as well. And in addition to professional activists, there are also volunteer activists and student activists. And student activists, this is a population that is dear and near to my heart. And Leah, do you mind going to the next slide? Yes. Yeah, so a couple of years ago, my colleague, Dr. Graziella Macera, and I started this project on the well-being of college social justice and human rights activists. Last year, we interviewed 53 student activists from around the greater metropolitan Washington area, and we found that student activists articulated their personal, familiar, organizational, and social impetus for involvement, and about half of them pinpoint their identity as the main reason why they got involved with activist work. And an overwhelming number of the participants, 94% of them, experienced burnout in their lifetime. And more than 81% of them say that they believe practicing self-care and maintaining well-being levels were very important. And 77% of them say that participating in activist work helped to alleviate their symptoms of a burnout, as this will allow them to work for better survival conditions for themselves and their peers. And the large majority of the population of the participants, they also said that the value of community and community care um, should be um, should be taken more seriously as compared to the more individualist concept of self-care. And they all indicated the lack of institutional support during the interviews. So we intend to expand our research to build a strong local, national, and global dataset on the well-being of college student activists, and that should serve as important evidence for policy making. And all these findings, they also point to the necessity and urgency to look for effective intervention tools to support our student activists. And only if we tend to the well-being of the student activists, we could help promote sustainable social movement and social change. So we started to publicize the findings, and we presented a university live symposium with a larger audience, being school administrators. We are also organizing a panel discussion on the well-being and student activism, inviting our student activists to share their powerful and hopeful stories on well-being and activism. We are also working with other institutions in the state of Virginia, trying to create a Virginia State Activist Network that will include a significant virtual community and annual events that will connect student activists and professional activists and could address the concerns of this population and provide a community for sharing research and practices. So this is a project I'm truly passionate about, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Cher. Any comments or questions? Oh,
There's something in the chat for Cher.
thank you. It says this one is for Louise, so I guess we could circle back for a very brief comment before we move into Susan's comments. So Anne has asked, this seems like such a large, complex problem. How do you begin to get your arms around it? So that is for Louise, if you're...
It's a very good question, but it's it's not as difficult as you think, because a lot of this activity goes online. And so there are now organizations that are working on human trafficking issues called Tech for Good. There are companies that will help provide data that give you a window into this. And then you sometimes need large-scale data analytics and artificial intelligence to understand these patterns. That's some of what we did when we were working on the human trafficking, not the human, the antiquities trafficking. And so when we went through this, there was a finding that a lot of the terrorist funding was coming through platforms and sales that were going on Facebook. And then after these discoveries, because our research results matched those of others, there was pressure placed on Facebook to do much more monitoring and be much more accountable of what they were selling on their platform. So that's one example of how, by understanding the supply chains and who's involved and using modern, analytical techniques, you can get a picture of what seems like a complex problem and really take it down to its pieces. The people on the ground who are dealing with this may be much more threatened. We're doing a project now on illicit timber trade out of the Amazon. And we've just completed that piece of work. And one of the people who helped us on our research, who was an indigenous governmental leader, had his life threatened because his investigations of corruption revealed very, very high-level support for this by government officials. But now there are journalists who read our work. They bring that to the attention of people. And so there are many different ways, once you do complex data analysis that reveals these patterns and makes it very clear who's behind it, you can then begin to put pressure points on people, but begin to reveal who the actors are. And this may not have much result in a very top-down authoritarian society, but societies in the middle in which citizens and activists have some space to operate, this work can be really invaluable.
Thank you. There was another question here as well, directed to Cher, which was it has disappeared, but I liked it, so I'm going to ask it anyhow, if that's all right. If there was any cultural differences in activism and how those differences across cultures impact well-being of the activists.
Yeah, and
Sure.
yeah, and definitely, I would say even within the United States, you do see the regional difference. And then if we define culture as kind of a local culture, and you could see a significant difference just across student activists. They come from different backgrounds and their cultural backgrounds. Actually, it's fascinating. You will see like Asian Americans, the and Latino Americans and African Americans, and the issues they pick for their activism are quite different. So their identity, their cultural background essentially have a larger say in what kind of a social issues, what kind of a social movement they would like to focus on. And we also did some research comparing student activists in US and in South Africa. So and there definitely culture it's one of the I would say main factors leading to different patterns of activism, and also the challenges they face during their activism. And for example, student activists in South Africa, their concerns are totally different are totally different. Even though, I mean, you will see that apartheid is a historical thing, but still they themselves are experiencing the impact of apartheid, and also they are trying to overcome that impact, and that also was the reason why they picked some of the issues. So essentially, the culture is the reason leading to their activism, and also culture is one of the main factors when they pick some of the issues for their activism. Hope
Thank
this
you.
answer your question.
Yeah, I hope so. I thought it was fascinating. But I would like to move on to Susan and let her give her remarks. So thank you, Susan.
Okay, thank you. So this has been great to hear everyone else's presentations. I've been really engaged. I'm Susan Allen. I'm a faculty member at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, where I direct the Center for Peacemaking Practice and a variety of projects within that focus on doing practice from within the university. I feel like the center is like planting a flag in the university and saying, doing practice belongs here too. And so we've been asked to speak about how we put research into practice, and I will do that, but I also want to speak about how I go from practice to building theory, and that doing the practice work is a way of also gaining insights and then sharing that experience with others in other contexts, and kind of cross fertilization and from one practice experience to another. So it's also knowledge creation. But the work that I've been doing most intensively in terms of work related to the Sustainable Development Goal 16 is work on peacemaking in the context of, you may know, the August 2008 war that broke out in the South Caucasus region. You may know it as the Russian-Georgian War, or the Georgian-Ossetian War. The Georgian-Abkhaz tensions were part of it. I've been working specifically to bridge across the Georgian-Ossetian divide that's been left in the aftermath of that war. So there's a ceasefire line in place, and very little contact across that ceasefire line, separating the Georgian and the South Ossetian communities. And what I have found is that being at a university gives an opportunity for Georgians and South Ossetians on each side of that ceasefire line to find that it's safe for them to engage in scholarly discussions, that's a culturally acceptable way in which they can be in the same room as people who are from the other side of that dividing line. And so kind of another, I guess my metaphor is that I'm someone who walks around holding up an umbrella for other people to meet under. So the Center for Peacemaking Practice is this umbrella for a bunch of practically related initiatives. For the Georgians and South Ossetians, I hold up an umbrella, or I rent a conference room and arrange travel at the time before the pandemic to meet in a conference center and to hold discussions. And I really try to be guided by what are the Georgians and South Ossetians ready to talk about, asking them to create the agenda, asking them to really take as much leadership as possible. And so this peacemaking approach has led to, if we talk about, change making, that has led to changes. So the changes that have come out of this have been, for example, prisoners have been released from both sides of the conflict area through an agreement that was discussed there as well as in other contexts. A dam was repaired, and a lot of background discussions happened in those unofficial dialogues. Irrigation water shared, and lots of other confidence building measures came out of those discussions. So these dialogues have been a place where Georgians and South Ossetians, I kind of was listening with interest as Louise described, under what contexts can individuals make a difference in addressing organized crime, for example. Well, under what context can individuals make a difference in peacemaking. And the Georgian and Ossetian context is one where there are a lot of threats against South Ossetians who are doing anything independent of the leadership's directions. And yet, people have felt that it's okay to go to a scholarly discussion at a university. It kind of seems like a safe thing for a professor to go do. And in that context, come up with some ideas like, gee, let's repair the dam. Let's look at how it's structured and what kind of repairs are needed. Let's look at how irrigation water could be shared. Let's, look at these prisoner releases. Let's look at ambulances crossing the ceasefire line and so forth. And then they've gone home and said, look, here's some ideas to talk about. And they've been eventually accepted. Not all of the ideas, but some of them. So this has been interesting to me that even in a place that many would call an authoritarian area, people have found a way, not a lot of space, but found some space for doing the peacemaking work. So in terms of research into practice, I think I've described a bit about the practice has been convening dialogues. I also, because I noticed a lot of students in our session describe how students have been involved in some of these dialogues. Some of the dialogues have happened in the U.S. That's a lot of travel for Georgians and South Ossetians to come all the way to the U.S. So most of the dialogues have happened closer to the South Caucasus, for example, in Turkey, in Armenia. And those I've managed for most of them to have a student come along and be a part of the dialogue process. And so that's been really helpful, I think, for the Georgians and Ossetians to look at future generations engaged and think about the future and how long do they want these tensions to go on, and how long can these various problems that come from a lack of settled political status, the Ossetians who don't have any access to travel, how long do they want that to go on? Having the younger generation there has been helpful. The other piece that I think for this audience is interesting to talk about is the way in which I promised to go from research to practice, but then also from practice to research. And so some of the research insights that I've come to from this work have been, for example, the local leadership and ways that can really influence. There have been times that I have thought, oh, why don't we do this? And they say, no, that won't work here. You really have to know the local cultural context in order to know what will work. And so to be able to listen to the local leadership has been really helpful. The concept of track 1.5 diplomacy, we've got a popular, in the conflict resolution field, a popular set of terms where we've got track 1 diplomacy being official diplomacy, and track 2 diplomacy being unofficial diplomacy, the kind of informal dialogues. Well, I found I was hosting dialogues where you might have someone whose title is foreign minister and someone else whose title is minister for reconciliation, and they're there at the same dialogue, but we're calling this an informal track 2, and we're having informal scholarly discussions, and nobody's making any serious formal commitments. They're all speaking on behalf of themselves as a person. So I came up with the phrase track 1.5. So from the practice experience where I couldn't categorize the work I was doing as either track 1 or track 2, came a new term. So I think I'm getting towards my time. I'll be happy to have discussions and hear also from fellow panelists on these issues too. I know, Louise, the organized crime issues in this area are ones that you and I had talked about a long, long time ago, and I'm sure they're still there. So it would be interesting to hear what you know about that.
Very much so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was fascinating. I see 2 questions from the audience, but then I have a couple questions that I'd like to pose to you and potentially facilitate some conversation with the audience as well. But first, if you could briefly answer, since we were just talking to Susan How do you choose the conflicts for which you raise your umbrella? And then we'll circle back to Louise to speak about culture from her point of view.
Okay, so how I choose the conflicts that I work in. I learned when I worked at the Carter Center in Atlanta, there was this kind of basic principle of the work there was only go where you're invited. And I was invited to Georgia. I was invited there 25 years ago. I was invited there in the 90s. And from that, I guess another principle I've learned is long-term work and long-term engagement. So I have, in fact, worked in other places, but this is the place I've worked the longest with the deepest roots and the biggest kind of level of trust with a lot of different actors and relationships where people are willing to take risks and engage in some creative discussions. So how I choose the places is where I'm invited. And I don't want to choose too many places because I do want to be able to be open to long-term engagement. I think that the kind of peacemaking work that's possible once really built is very different than the kind that can happen in 1 year. So long-term engagement when that's possible. The other thing about working in the South Caucasus is I speak Russian, and being able to work without a translator is very helpful. I don't speak Georgian and I don't speak Ossetian, but I do speak a common language that most of the people my age and older in that region do speak.
Excellent, thank you. And Louise, do you want to?
Okay, shall we go then to Louise?
Yes. Why don't we go to Louise and talk about culture again?
All right. So there are many people who are affiliated with TRAC who have very different backgrounds and experiences. So, for example, one of our fellows, Shaska Byerly, wrote a book on anti-corruption activism, where she worked in many different parts of the world to see how people organized on anti-corruption activities and what worked. And she and we are now planning on some future activities in this area and what we can do. This morning, I was on a discussion with colleagues at the UN Peace University, and that was brought by another colleague who works at TRAC. These are not all faculty members. These are people with more practical experience who affiliate with us and try to use a university as a base because of all these things that Susan was talking about. And so we were having discussions with the UN Peace University in Costa Rica because they are seeing the illicit trade that's going on to the south of them and around them in Central America as being so destabilizing, and what's going on in Mexico, and how we can think about these issues and the forces that stabilize them and destabilize them. So people working in a university setting can have sort of more restrained goals versus people who are on the ground where anti-corruption work can be very, very dangerous, have often much more fiery and determined personalities, but they are also, how they seek to do this is very much shaped by the culture in which they grew up in. Otherwise, if they seem alien to their culture, they're not going to get traction with their community members.
Excellent, thank you. I think I'd like to ask the next question, and if people from the audience would like to weigh in as well and potentially generate some discussion, please do. But for all of the panelists, could you please talk about what are some of the benefits and challenges of doing this type of engaged, practice-oriented research from within a university? Karina, go ahead.
Okay, probably the first one. So, it's, first of all, it's great to be in university because you have a lot of resources and you have a lot of faculties who, like Susan and in my school, for example, like Louise and Cher and other schools, who do a lot of work between practice and research, and reflecting specifically on research and practice. And it's also great because we work, the particular project I discussed, for example, we work university to university. And this example, I just give one example, but we work with the same university on project of dialogue and difference. Before Crimea was occupied, for example, in Ukraine, we organized Crimean Institute of Peace. We work in other countries very similar with universities. This gives you very strength to credibility to go and work with other institutions of higher education and also with the government. But in the same time, what is limitations of working being in university is that it's very hard to keep your presence on the ground, because for many projects you really need to be there. You need to engage, you be in constant contact. And actually, what is great about COVID is, let's say, but there is something always good side, that it's become more and more acceptable that you actually engage in practice and training and seminars through online. For example, now I'm working with on another project in Ukraine with history education, and I already gave several lectures, and I will be conducting an entire 3-day training for history teachers through online. That's become more acceptable, so you don't need to every time to be on the ground. But this is a limitation of university because we engaged in teaching, we could not be there for them.
Excellent. Cher, Susan, Louise, any thoughts? Cher?
Yeah, so I would say the manpower and brain power probably are the advantage of working within the university. So the manpower, because I'm conducting interdisciplinary research, right? So I mean, only in the university, you can go to different disciplines and you gain different perspective, and that actually is very enriching for my own projects. And because human rights issues, any issue you cannot solve by just focusing on one discipline. So that is my research. And I would say within the university, you also it's easier to find someone who share the same passion that you do, and then who share the same compassion as you do. So that is very encouraging, I guess, for a human rights scholar. So I would say that definitely is the advantage. In terms of challenge, I would say, because I like to involve students in my projects, but students, they come and go. So when you try to establish some long-term partnership with the local organizations, it's hard if you don't have it takes some time to build this type of a partnership. But students, they graduate. So sometimes it's very fun that we have this great group, and we are so proud of, and they have graduated. So for me, that is one of the most challenging part. And the second one is Korean mentioned resources, but for some reason I feel like looking for funding. It's also challenging too, because if you want to have a robust data, and it requires large amount of funding. So faculty members, you spend a lot of time at teaching and doing research, but also you spend a lot of time on trying to get some funding. For me, that is it's challenging too.
Susan or Louise? Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to add, so Cher brought up challenges as well, because there's so many advantages of doing this practice engagement and change making from within a university, but there's also challenges. So funding can be one. And then also all the other responsibilities that come with being in a university, where we're teaching and we're mentoring and we're doing other work and we're doing the practical work too. We held a conference at Point of View, our research and retreat facility for conflict resolution, a conference on doing practice from within the academy. And there was a whole day of the challenges of basically one senior faculty member at MIT came out with, look, you just have to have two jobs. You do your professor job and you do your practice job, because it's the the demands of the academy don't often acknowledge the practice benefits for research. And so that's one reason I like to always mention that it's not just my research going into practice, but it's also the practice is part of my research, and I'm gaining insights and knowledge creation through the practice work. Because I have a vision that the academy will shift to being more accepting of practice-based insights as valid knowledge that belongs to the academy as well.
Excellent.
I think that the university provides a very important platform because we're seen as neutral, we're seen as that's my spam in the background. We're seen as neutral, we're seen as honest brokers. And one of the things that we've been able to do during the pandemic is to do outreach to communities around the world. So as I said, we had this panel last week on environment and corruption and investigative journalists. And we had hundreds of people sign up, and 270 of them showed up. They had signed up from 80 different countries, many of them in the field. And because this is a university, people know that they're going to be getting honest information, that they can count on what they're going to get is vetted, and there's a great deal of trust that comes with this. And the relationships that develop online now, just like used to develop in the past in personal meetings, but now these relationships can be developed globally. And I think that's really, really important. And academics bring something we're not think tanks that we're advocating for a particular policy. We're sources of information and insight of what might work.
Excellent. And then the second question I had for you all is, how do you ensure the sustainability of your project so that the work can carry into the future and/or the changes that you're working to make can endure?
I can say something on that, and
Sure.
then I'll go back. Is that, as Susan mentioned, I used to work in Georgia, and we had an anti-corruption, anti-organized crime project in Georgia that went on for many years. And Susan asked me, in the chat box, are you still doing this? And the answer is no. We developed wonderful domestic capacity, and those people are doing the work. They're teaching at the university, they're doing projects. In fact, they got so good they're advising other countries. One of the people is a major professor in the UK and comes back to Georgia and brings his knowledge and his networks back every summer to teach and help promote what he knows. So it's very hard to develop institutions as an academic, but you can help develop people who are important agents of change.
Yeah, I'll add to that. That actually, there's ways that the way I look at kind of the work I do is that I won't be needed anymore, and that at one point, the Georgian and Ossetian peacemakers taking real leadership of this and doing, even to the point that they would schedule the hotel and do the grant writing would be the long-term sustainability. So I'm not there yet, but I hope to get there. And so one of the question to your question, Lee, the one of the ways is really encouraging the local leadership and stepping back whenever I can, not putting myself forward as the outsider and the university professor, but rather being ready to respond when they ask for things, but also stepping back and letting them really exert the leadership.
For me, sustainability is probably in majority of projects is transfer of knowledge. So then we go in and work with local communities, local administrations, the most important local educational institutions, and transform them knowledge in terms of resources and educate them. So they now become agents of change. And it's very, what we found that especially in our discipline, it's very new for many. For many universities, they never heard about it. For example, I was helping to establish the very first program on conflict resolution in Lebanon, which needed it for so long, right? So then, and through this transfer of knowledge, we create people who can educate others, but also who become advocates for our field. Those who actually promote it and want more and more, want to establish more active programming, like, for example, Institute of Peace.
Yeah, for me, I totally agree. I think that working in a team and then creating a network that will increase the capacity building for the future potential change makers. I think they essentially could help make your project sustainable. And the second thing I would like to say I pick a project I feel passionate about, and I think that it's very important to me to keep myself emotionally sustainable so I could keep going. I mean, only something that you're truly passionate about will carry you forward. So that would be kind of a personal way to make it sustainable. And I do think building a team and having a network, and that could be truly mutually reinforcing for you and for the larger project, the larger community you are working for.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any additional comments in the chat box yet, but I would like to ask you guys, oh, Susan, if you want, I was going to suggest a question around, given the number of students who are with us, any thoughts or advice on students getting involved in this type of research practice or impact work?
I have worked with a lot of students who think, oh, I would never, travel far abroad and do international peacemaking, but we have plenty of peace work to do in the U.S. Plenty. And lots of building mutual understanding and lots of chances to, hold dialogues, whether it's red-blue dialogues or urban-rural dialogues, or there are lots of opportunities to do this work locally. There have been groups that work with diaspora, so Armenian and Azerbaijani diaspora meeting together, Turkish and Armenian diaspora meeting together. Pick your conflict region. The U.S. has a diaspora for most of these conflicts. So there's lots of opportunities to either work on local U.S. conflicts, racial conflict in the U.S., political conflict in the U.S., etc. So it doesn't need to be the travel abroad and commit to working in a certain place for 20 years. It can be a model of, okay, I live here. Let's work where I live too. And I've worked in some of my classes. I've had great success with just asking students to think about what conflicts are they engaged in already. Whether, we had a student who was working at Starbucks as a barista who had these big conflicts with customer service stuff and different, the staff stuff. And these conflicts became really real examples of some of the theories we were working through. So you really don't have to take the big geopolitical conflict to engage in this stuff. It can be, start where you're at and bridge from there.
Karina, Cher, Louise, any thoughts? And then Susan, you had something you were going to say earlier.
I do. I had a question as I was sitting here looking at my computer. I see 5 women here speaking about this, and I wondered, did any of us have any reflections on here we are? What is it that made this panel be 5 women? Is it, just chance, or how did it come together? And for me, I see in my role in the peace work that there's kind of an advantage to being a woman in the culture where I'm working. There's kind of a sense that, oh, well, sure, we can let her do that because it's not going to cause too much trouble. there's a little bit of diminished sense of, oh, she's harmless, she's this woman. And it works for peacemaking, because people come, and then revolutionary ideas come out, and people go implement them. So that's kind of all right with me for the short term to have that. But I wonder about the rest of you and your work. Is there any gendered aspect to it?
I actually would disagree with you in this. I think what make probably it's here because what I found that in academia specifically, there is a gender difference, and women more tend to be oriented to community and more work with community and do more practice work and more care about change. And I see even we do work and we write books and we do theories, while I I found that male more prefer to do more like classic academic work. At least what I noticed. If you look even into our school, there isn't balance, and I know Louise, she's just a really force of nature, and no, really, it's like I see that it's women who really move in this engagement part because we care. We just don't want to look at books and develop science for this purpose. But again, I might be prejudiced on bias.
It's very important in my outside life, outside the university. I'm also a bit of an activist. As someone mentioned, we have problems in this country at the moment. And for a little over 4 years ago, I started with another woman an anti-corruption advocacy network to try and address our corruption here. And we started with 6 people. Now it's 3 women that are running it. And we're now about 750 people who are actively participating in this. But we're all researchers. And I think part of why we're able to do this in such a polarized society, because we have people of both parties and different range of political views, is that we are women, no one perceives us as doing this for our career promotion. They see that we're doing this, which takes large chunks of what was once our spare time. And people are very receptive to that. They see this as a service and not something that's done to this. And we always refer to everything as collective. It's not like we do it. We convene this group. And so there's women, I think, are really coalition builders. And they often, not always, but often perform that role in universities. And so you have a degree of space to operate in that makes it a little easier.
Yeah, my story probably is more similar to Karina, and I kind of disagree with you, Susan, because I feel like I have been patronized throughout my entire life. So just they will feel like you are harmless, so there will be sometimes. I mean, occasionally it could serve as an advantage, but most of the time you feel lack of respect and from the students, from particular my male colleagues, and from practitioners on the ground. So you will have to work really hard to gain their respect. They wouldn't think you will be making troubles, so that is the advantage. But I would say more disadvantage. You have to work really hard to gain respect always everywhere. So for some reason I feel like this is probably just me, or I'm not sure if it's just me. And so it's so great to see like Louise and Karina and Susan. You could just your presence is there, and then so no question about that. So I'm working towards that.
If I could just say, Karina and Cher, you both said you were disagreeing with me, but every word you made was trying to speak just about the Setian context and just in the context of doing that work, what my experience has been. So I did not mean to speak of that being the experience at the university. Apologies if I wasn't clear. And I agree with you all, if you disagree with me.
Well, fantastic. We're down to our last 2 minutes. Are there any final comments that any of you would like to make? No, thank you all for this fantastic conversation. It was a pleasure. And I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed it as well. And feel free to reach out to any or all of us if you have additional thoughts or questions. I'm sure we'd all like to hear from you. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Leah, for organizing and putting such a great panel together.
Excellent. It's a pleasure to get to know you all.
Yeah. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.